Greetings again, lords of the internet. Apologize, I still have a bit of a rough throat, but I think I am at the very least competent enough to get through this video. I've been wanting to make for a while, but its actual production was precipitated by the talk I had with my friend this past week about the perpetuation of consciousness. Now, this isn't directed at any one individual, but in general, I've seen a tendency for a number of years, and this is indubitably due to the proliferation of many different ideologies across what we know as the internet, to effectively call everything ideology. And in particular, a lack of refined differentiation between having a set of goals or describing a set of goals and ideology itself. And this is very tricky, obviously, because goals can be contained within an ideological framework, which is to say one can have ideological goals and then lesser types of goals within that ideological framework or within the greater superstructure of the ideology or even the ideological goals. And I think this is just sloppy reasoning when somebody says, well, that's just ideology. In particular, the discussion I had with my friend. Now, as someone interested in definitions, generally speaking, and the delimitation of categories, I think we have a general sense of what things are and what they are not. And when people drift into the area of anything is everything and everything is anything, we're effectively lost in a morass of postmodernist thought. It might not be deliberately postmodernist, but it does smack of that. Well, everything's theology. Now, I want to return to the discussion I had with my friend and go over some key concepts. Now, notice how both of us, he and I, agreed that these were not objective goals we're setting forth or things that even we should of necessity strive for. We delineated the situation that humanity finds itself in, and we said, given observable data, here's the empirical line of thinking, what can we do with this? It was more a question of, look at the many different phenomena throughout the universe. And of all of these phenomena, the thing that strikes us as perhaps unique and salient is consciousness. It's a deeply mysterious thing, even though I think it's reasonably safe to say it has an organic origin. I mean, it seems to reside in our meat bag, in our brain. But what its constituent parts, I mean, consciousness is one of the final mysteries. We just don't really understand it very well. But we can't deny its existence. Even if this were all just a computer simulation, we're experiencing a computer simulation in the form of some sort of conscious appreciation of that. And it might be that it's a unique event. I mean, there are, of course, degrees of consciousness. You could say a brontosaurus might have had consciousness, but the degree of that, the level of self-awareness a brontosaurus might have had is I think, dubiously low. But the idea here was not that all of humanity should be propelled towards escape velocity, because this would be the best thing. And I think this is where the confusion arises. Ideologies, generally speaking, proclaim some hypothetical better world that is entailed and embedded in their framework, in their postulates, in their claims. This is not at all what he and I were discussing, or really my approach in general. Now, there is a claim that empiricism itself is theological, but as a method of exploring the world and trying to understand it and make sense of it, and then consequently shaping or reshaping the world or restructuring the world, it's not a bad toolkit to have. To claim that that is just ideological in its nature, look, you can definitely get a kind of ideology of the perpetuation of consciousness unto nigh eternity if you set it up right. But I don't think I personally, or my friend, are advocating that. because we, based on empirical data, observe that we can't really discern an objective meaning from the universe. But one unique thing, even highly unique, that's a bit of an oxymoron, but highly unique thing, is this consciousness. So what do we do with that in a hypothetical framework of having a goal? Notice how I think it'd be very, very unlikely that somebody would say to somebody else, "Oh, your goal is to learn how to run a -4 minute mile." That's ideology, and you have a set of principles that will abet you in this task. Well, clearly that's ideology. I mean, and you could, in fact, believe it or not, probably get an ideology. We can just call it, for the purposes of this discussion, -4 minute mileism, right? But why would that be ideology in this particular case? It would be ideology, -4 minute mileism, if in fact there was a proclamation that -4 minute mileism were the best case scenario, potential hypothetical scenario for society, and that all resources should be directed towards this, and that once you achieve this -4 minute mileism, it would be, everything will be the best it can possibly be. Try to extrapolate that from the conversation that I had with my friend. You won't find that, because neither of us were using the term best X can be. Indeed, to even approach the concept of perpetuation of consciousness as a sort of primary goal for the species, you have to be fairly red-pilled. And I have made many videos. I think the most prominent one would be the problem of philosophical course correction, which has been demonetized. I like mentioning that, don't I? I don't know why that one was, but whatever. Citing that the red pill and the incumbent changes that affect an individual isn't necessarily the healthiest thing. It doesn't make you feel good, and as a rule, it tends to immiserate you. It can even render you suicidal. In the worst case scenario, it can immiserate you, render you suicidal, and then in that process of immiseration, you somehow gain the wherewithal to off yourself, and I've seen it happen. I've had subscribers over the years who write to me, and I try to counsel them to some degree, and then they just disappear, and they spoke of suicide very often. So I'm acknowledging that the acquisition of the red pill, in as much as it's related to these other goals, is probably going to depress the fuck out of most people, and it's not healthy and beneficial in the short run at all. That's hardly the prediction of a terrestrial utopia. Now look at other things like communism throughout the 20th century. I mean, the basic tenet going back to the days of Marx, that if workers control the means of production, everything will be fine, and it obviously got overhauled, but its implementation was always disastrous. But because of its ideological nature, and ideology is prophetic in some sense. It's prophetic not in the sense that the prophecies come true, but ideology by its nature deigns to prophesize that if X is the case, then Y will result, and this Y will be absolutely fantastic. Only that, historically, the ideologies that we can observe never yielded Y. Communism is, I think, the most prominent example, because it never ceases to be. And people seem to promote it over and over again. So if only we do this, and there are milder versions. I think various forms of socialism are a reinforcement of this idea of workers controlling the means of production, etc., etc. But nowhere in the discussion I had with my friend, and nowhere in my own personal belief system or videos I've produced, do I say if X occurs, things will be utopian and fantastic. I just think that consciousness is this unique property that it might exist elsewhere, and there are issues of the Fermi paradox and what have you, but if what can you observe, it's a unique property, and a unique property that is deeply mysterious, but is a signature feature of what humanity has evolved into. So why jettison that, if in fact it cannot be preserved in the current state that humanity is in? Now, in essence, unless you want to call survival ideology, it's basically a goal of survival of consciousness, this manifestation that we can, of whatever it might ultimately be. Survival is the end game. Now, you could argue that a farmer or a hunter engaged either respectively in planting crops or hunting deer or other game in order to get a meal together, that they're engaged in ideological framework too. But in fact, they're trying to feed themselves. They're trying to survive. They're trying to maintain the integrity of their corporeal bodies. The maintenance of consciousness beyond the corporeal, I think, is just an extension of that. And at the moment, it seems that the seat of consciousness is corporeal, the brain. But I think there are limitations to that survival mechanism because the brain ceases to be, and therewith consciousness. Now, if we look at the pure dictionary definition of ideology, I think it's quite revealing from dictionary.com, the body of doctrine, myth, belief, etc., that guides an individual's social movement, institution, class, or large group. There was no dictate that if we do this, then something will, some great plan that will guide humanity to greatness. Escape velocity, at the end of the day, as a concept that I've introduced historically, is nothing more than an extension of survival instinct beyond the earthly limitations that we are endowed with. And I think that it's important to distinguish between goals and ideology. The other thing about ideology that differentiates itself from a hard set of goals per se is that ideology by its nature tends to be quite recalcitrant, which is to say, it doesn't do well with the adduction of new facts and new points of data. The whole point of being empirical is changing your point of view in line with a new flow of information that might reshape your mind and basically give you food for thought. Ideologies, by their very nature, because they have a certain structure, do not do well with that and will either defend against that, or to the extent that there is acknowledgement, there are usually attempts at suppression of information. We see this throughout the dominant far-left ideology when it comes to things like sex realism or race realism, or however you want to put it. And clearly there's an agenda for that, a reason behind that. Any ideology that's proclaiming some utopian vision of how things will be will not be enamored of facts and data that run counter to it, but will make use of it when it is useful. I mean, look at the whole lesbian gay movement, they say, well, I think it's obviously there's a genetic component, some genetic component, and obviously has some brain factors. You see, this feature shows that homosexual brains have exhibit patterns that are more similar to women than to men, blah, 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 whatever. And so they're all too happy to make use of data points like that, but other things not so much. But that's what an ideology does. I don't think anyone, for example, people find it disputable, for whatever reason, that the claim that it seems that consciousness has an organic receptacle and point of inception. But both my friend and I would be very willing, upon receiving sufficient evidence to the contrary, that to accept that it's not the case, that consciousness is independent of the brain. I mean, that is not the position of an ideologue. And if anyone has seen my own personal evolution of thought across the many years I've been on YouTube now, I think that's further evidence. So I think having goals is not the same thing as, even if these goals are far sweeping and wide scale, it's not the same thing as having a certain ideological point of view that you wish to thrust upon the entirety of the world. And we see this, we've seen this throughout the 20th century, we see this now. They're not the same things. You see this even in petty left, right-wing politics in the United States. Look at a guy like Ben Shapiro. Hey, gang, if we get rid of the Democrats, everything will be fine, gang. Okay? Liberals are a big problem, gang. All right. No one I know in my circle of confidants believes things like that. That if you only do X, you'll get Y. This is an extremely simplistic way of thinking. But every ideology is like that. From communism to German-style fascism back in the early mid-20th century, to it just runs the gamut. So it's not. I just don't really. It doesn't really add up to me that an idea of escape velocity is an extension of the pursuit of survival. In this case, the survival of the phenomenon of consciousness is in of itself ideological. Now, if you were to go on to say that it's the best possible thing you could do for humanity in a universe lacking objective meaning, well, and by the way, I know I would be accused, well, you're an ideologue because you believe the universe lacks objective meaning. Well, I'm just basing it on what we can observe. A universe of gas giants, supernovas, an eventual heat death, there doesn't seem to be any meaning in the human sense, so I just go on the evidence. In any event, no, that's not the case. Then clearly most people would not be on board with some of these ideas, just as most people are sickened by red pill ideas as a general rule. It's just a goal. Escape velocity is just a goal. There could be visionary aspects to it, but it's not really the same thing as saying, let's reshape society until we reach this utopian ideal. I think things in the long run would improve, but they wouldn't be utopian. There are always problems. Anyway, I think I've covered this topic sufficiently, but I mean, there's this tendency these days to call everything ideology, and every belief system ideology, and every set of goals ideology. I mean, unless we arrive at a state with escape velocity akin to something like minus 4-minute mileism. And by the way, once again, you see what's faulty about minus 4-minute mileism is that most people lack the genetic capacity to run a minus 4-minute mile. So you could keep on perpetuating and saying, well, if only everybody could run a minus 4-minute mile, everything would be fantastic. Just like the doctrines of communism, of the various fascisms of the early 20th century, etc., etc. Anyway, that is all I have to say about this topic. There will be more to come. Thanks for tuning in. As always, may the gods watch over you. Bye-bye. If you liked this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you enjoy my content, please consider making a donation or becoming a patron. Thanks for watching.